Princes of the Yen book is not yet available in Chinese, but in English at the website quantumpublishers.com. They'll be happy to send it to China. I hope it will be published in Chinese soon. The book that is now available in Chinese is in the English language is entitled Where Does Money Come From? And that is more fundamental in a way about this question, where does actually our money supply come from? Where does money come from? And of course, the key role is being played by banks. And the banks, of course, are being influenced by the central bank. And hence, your question is very, very relevant. How do we compare these different central banks? And of course, Princes of the Yen has a lot on the Japanese central bank. But there is one chapter about the other Asian central banks. There is one chapter about the ECB. And there is a chapter on the Fed in there as well. So one gets a bit of a comparison as well. And so to answer your question, the Japanese central bank has been, in many ways, a sort of experimental ground for Western central banking, it seems to me, because a lot of things that happened in Japan then later were adopted by the ECB and even by the Federal Reserve. And I don't mean just QE, because before QE, we also had other policies that later were copied by, for example, the ECB, just to give you an example. So the fundamental relationship seems to be that the Bank of Japan has been used by other central banks in the central banking fraternity. You know, they always meet in Basel in Switzerland and they discuss things. And it seems that the Bank of Japan was trying new stuff. And then others said, okay, we'll do that. Now, some of that stuff is not good stuff. And they still copied it, which again comes back to the earlier question, you know, why are they doing things that are not wise? Maybe their policy objectives are different. So a key example is the policy of the 1980s that the Bank of Japan adopted. The Bank of Japan had put in place since 1942 a policy called window guidance. This is guidance of bank credit. And it's a very powerful tool, which was originally developed by the German central bank. And later, you know, Japan copied that, like many things from Germany. And the tool was used for the high growth economic system. And it's a successful tool. And we've seen this also in China. It's a good tool. And the central banks have usually used it wisely, certainly in China. But the Bank of Japan then deviated from the 80s. And in my view, this is under US pressure. Because Japan, to put it very simply, was getting too successful for the liking of the Americans. One US industry after another suffered from Japanese competition, whether it was first shipbuilding, then steel, then automobiles, then electronics. And so there was a lot of trade friction. America was putting pressure on Japan. You must change your system. You're too closed. They couldn't say publicly, you're too successful. So they said, oh, you're inefficient and we'll give you advice on how to be more efficient, which was somewhat not credible. Are you saying Japan should be even more efficient and even more successful? Well, actually, they were saying, really, we want Japan to be less successful, so you please change your policies. And that's a very difficult task for Japan to do. Essentially, the politicians didn't do it, but the Bank of Japan, which is very much under influence of the Federal Reserve since 1945, they did it. And you can see it in their plans. They published the Maekawa report in the 1980s, which said that there's a 10-year plan to change the economic structure fundamentally, shift away from exports to domestic demand expansion, deregulate, liberalize, privatize, the sort of policies the IMF and the World Bank recommend developing countries to do, which is a good way of reducing growth and preventing economic development. So this is a way to weaken the Japanese economy. But how is the Bank of Japan going to implement these policies? And that's where it gets slightly mysterious. They also were not saying it directly. The Maekawa report only says the central bank should use its monetary policy flexibly in order to implement a structural transformation of the economy, including political changes, deregulation, liberalization, privatization. Now, there's only one way you can use monetary policy to do this, and that is by using window guidance to expand bank credit for asset purchases, creating a huge asset bubble, which happened from 86 to 89. It was done under Mr. Fukui as head of the banking department at the Bank of Japan, who told them you must increase lending for these asset purchases, for property, real estate speculation. And then they tightened it. They told the banks, no, you must tighten. And then you bust the bubble bursts, the banking system goes bust, you get a big recession, a long recession that you can extend if you want to. And they extended it for over 20 years. And during that time, they said things like, oh, see, we're in a recession. The system is not working. We have to implement structural reform and deregulate, liberalize, and privatize.